The man stood alone at the edge of the frozen Delaware River, his breath rising in short white clouds against the black December sky. Behind him, thousands of exhausted men waited in silence, farmers, laborers, immigrants, boys barely old enough to shave. Their boots were torn, their coats thin, their bellies empty. Many of them were already bleeding, leaving dark stains in the snow. Across the river stood the most powerful empire on earth. And if this night failed, the idea called America would die before it was fully born. George Washington tightened his cloak, staring into the darkness. He knew something most of his men did not. This was not merely a battle. It was a final gamble against extinction. The rebellion was collapsing. Enlistments were expiring. Congress was fleeing. Loyalists were everywhere. The British believed the war was already over. History would later remember this moment as heroic, but in that instant, it felt more like desperation. This is the true story of how a fragile experiment built on fear, contradiction, courage, and blood survived impossible odds to become the United States of America. Not the myth, the reality. Long before muskets cracked at Lexington or cannons roared at Yorktown, America began as an accident, an unintended consequence of European greed. In the early 1600s, England was not searching for freedom, it was searching for profit. The New World was a rumor then, a dangerous whisper carried by sailors who spoke of endless forests, rivers filled with fish, and lands so vast it seemed without end. To the English crown, these lands were not homes for liberty, but assets, territory to be claimed before Spain or France took it first. When the first permanent English settlement was planted at Jamestown in 1607, it was not built by idealists, it was built by investors. The men who arrived were unprepared, undisciplined, and deeply divided by class. Many were gentlemen who believed labor was beneath them. Others were desperate laborers promised land they might never see. Disease, starvation, and internal conflict nearly erased the colony within its first years. If not for the knowledge and mercy of Native American tribes, Jamestown would have vanished into the wilderness, just another failed European dream. From the very beginning, America survived not because it was strong, but because it was stubborn, and because someone else always paid the price. As colonies spread along the Atlantic coast, they did not grow equally. In New England, Puritans arrived fleeing religious persecution, but they carried their own rigid beliefs with them. They dreamed of building a city upon a hill, a society so pure it would shame the corruption of Europe. Yet this vision of moral perfection came at a cost. Dissent was not tolerated. Those who questioned authority, people like Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, were banished, branded heretics in a land supposedly founded on freedom of conscience. Native tribes were pushed aside, treaties broken whenever expansion demanded it. Freedom in early America was selective. In the southern colonies, a different engine drove growth: tobacco, cotton, sugar. Plantation economies demanded enormous labor forces, and European indentured servants were not enough. Slowly, deliberately, the colonies turned toward Africa. Human beings were bought, sold, chained, and shipped across the ocean like cargo. By the early 1700s, slavery was no longer a temporary solution, it was the foundation of colonial wealth. This contradiction would define America forever, a land that spoke of liberty while profiting from bondage. By the mid-18th century, 13 British colonies stretched from New Hampshire to Georgia. They were diverse, argumentative, and deeply unequal, but they shared one crucial reality: they were British. They spoke English, traded under English law, and pledged loyalty to the king. For decades, most colonists had no desire to break away. Britain protected them, bought their goods, and largely left them alone. That balance shattered after a war fought thousands of miles away. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, was a global conflict between empires. Britain emerged victorious, but victory came with a crushing debt. Someone had to pay. London looked across the Atlantic. The colonies, Parliament argued, had benefited from British protection. It was only fair they help shoulder the cost. New taxes followed: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties. To Parliament, these were reasonable measures. To the colonists, they were a violation of something sacred. They had no representatives in Parliament, no voice, no vote. No taxation without representation was not just a slogan, it was a warning. Tensions rose, protests erupted. British soldiers were sent to enforce order. In Boston, a city already simmering with resentment, the inevitable happened. On a cold March night in 1770, a crowd confronted a small group of redcoats. Insults turned into thrown objects. Confusion exploded into gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. The Boston Massacre was not a massacre by modern standards, but it became a symbol, a spark igniting a larger fire. Propaganda spread faster than truth. Anger hardened into ideology. By the time tea was dumped into Boston Harbor in 1773, compromise was nearly impossible. Britain responded with force. The colonies responded with defiance. And on an April morning in 1775, at Lexington and Concord, shots were fired that could never be taken back. The American Revolution had begun. But revolution is never as clean as it sounds. 1/3 of colonists supported independence. 1/3 remained loyal to the crown. 1/3 simply wanted to survive. Families split. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Loyalists were beaten, exiled, or executed. Patriots were imprisoned or hanged. The war was not only against Britain, it was a civil war within America itself. When the Second Continental Congress named George Washington commander of the Continental Army, they chose a man who understood power, discipline, and optics. He looked the part. He carried himself like authority. But even Washington knew the truth. They were outmatched. The British Army was the most professional fighting force in the world. The Continental Army was a patchwork of militias, poorly supplied and barely trained. Desertion was constant. Disease killed more than bullets. And yet, against all logic, the rebellion endured. Losses mounted. Victories were rare. By late 1766, the revolution was on the brink of collapse. That was when Washington turned toward the Delaware River and toward history. The boats scraped softly against the icy shore as Washington's men stepped into the freezing darkness. Some of them had wrapped rags around their feet because they had no boots left. Others left bloody footprints behind them, each step a silent testament to how close the revolution already was to dying. The crossing of the Delaware was not glorious. It was miserable. Ice floes crashed against the hulls, threatening to overturn them. Wind tore through thin coats. Men slipped, cursed, prayed. Many could not swim. If they fell, they vanished beneath the black water without a sound. Washington crossed last. He stood upright in the boat, an impossible silhouette against the storm, refusing to sit even as ice struck his legs. He knew his men were watching. If he fell, the rebellion would fall with him. By dawn, they reached Trenton. The Hessian garrison, German mercenaries hired by Britain, never saw it coming. Exhausted from Christmas celebrations, convinced the Americans were broken, they were unprepared for an attack through snow and sleet. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it ended, nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. The Americans lost only a handful of men. Militarily, it was a small victory. Psychologically, it changed everything. News of Trenton spread like fire. Soldiers re-enlisted. Civilians donated supplies. Hope returned to a cause that had been seconds from collapse. America had survived another day. But survival did not mean unity. As the war dragged on, cracks deepened. The Continental Congress argued endlessly, unable to fund the army properly. States hoarded resources. Inflation made paper money nearly worthless. Soldiers went months without pay. Washington wrote desperate letters begging for food, clothing, ammunition, often receiving nothing. And beneath it all lay a question no one wanted to answer. What kind of nation was this supposed to become? In 1776, Thomas Jefferson had written words that would echo through history. All men are created equal. Jefferson himself owned slaves. So did many of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Equality, like freedom, was still theoretical. For enslaved people, the Revolution offered confusion rather than clarity. The British, seeing opportunity, promised freedom to those who escaped rebel masters and joined the crown. Thousands fled plantations, risking torture or death to reach British lines. Some succeeded, many did not. On the Patriot side, the question of slavery was avoided whenever possible. Independence was hard enough without confronting America's deepest moral contradiction. And yet, that contradiction never stopped watching. The war shifted south. Britain believed Southern loyalists would rise in support. Instead, the conflict devolved into brutal guerrilla warfare. Farms were burned. Civilians were targeted. Brothers fought brothers. Victory became less about battles and more about endurance. France watched carefully. For years, the French monarchy had secretly supplied money and weapons to weaken Britain, but open alliance required proof that the Americans could actually win. That proof came at Saratoga in 1777. When British General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, Europe took notice. France officially entered the war, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French ships challenged British naval dominance. French soldiers marched alongside Americans. Without France, the revolution would almost certainly have failed. This, too, would be conveniently forgotten later. The final blow came at Yorktown in 1781. British General Cornwallis, trapped on a peninsula, waited desperately for rescue by sea, but French warships blocked the Chesapeake Bay. Washington and French General Rochambeau closed in by land. When Cornwallis surrendered, the war was effectively over. America had won its independence. But victory raised new questions far more dangerous than British muskets. What now? The colonies were no longer colonies. They were states, jealous of their autonomy, wary of centralized power, terrified of becoming the very tyranny they had just escaped. The first attempt at governance, the Articles of Confederation, created a nation too weak to function. Congress could not tax, it could not regulate trade, it could not enforce its own laws. Economic chaos followed. Rebellions erupted. In Massachusetts, farmers crushed by debt took up arms against their own government. Shays' rebellion sent shockwaves through the elite. The revolution, it seemed, might consume itself. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles. Unofficially, they planned something radical. They planned to start over. The Constitutional Convention was held in secrecy. Windows were shut, guards were posted. The men inside, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, argued relentlessly. Large states against small states, federal power against state power, North against South, slavery against everything else.
Compromise became the only path forward. The result was a document both brilliant and deeply flawed. The Constitution created a strong federal government, balanced by checks and balances. It established three branches, a system designed not to empower virtue, but to restrain ambition. But it also protected slavery. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, enough to boost Southern political power, not enough to grant humanity. The document spoke of liberty while embedding inequality into its structure. Ratification was not guaranteed. Opponents feared centralized tyranny. Supporters promised future amendments. The Bill of Rights was born from that fear, a list of protections meant to shield individuals from government overreach. Slowly, state by state, the Constitution was accepted. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. There was no precedent, no roadmap. Every decision risked destroying the fragile Union. Washington set traditions that still shape America: peaceful transfer of power, civilian control of the military, restraint in authority. He could have been king. He chose not to be. Yet even as the Republic took shape, its contradictions grew sharper. Political parties formed despite warnings against them. Economic divisions widened. Slavery expanded westward. Native American nations were pushed aside through treaties broken almost as soon as they were signed. America was free, but not free for everyone. The dream survived. The reality demanded payment. And history was far from finished.
When George Washington stepped away from the presidency after 2 terms, the world watched in disbelief. Kings did not surrender power voluntarily. Generals did not walk back into private life. Yet Washington did both, understanding that the survival of the Republic depended not on his authority, but on the idea that no man was indispensable. His farewell address warned of dangers he believed could destroy the nation from within: foreign entanglements, excessive debt, and political parties driven more by passion than reason. America ignored nearly all of it. The new nation immediately fractured into rival visions of its future. Alexander Hamilton believed in a strong central government, a national bank, and close economic ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson believed in limited federal power, agrarian independence, and sympathy for revolutionary France. These were not polite disagreements, they were battles for the soul of the Republic. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans hardened into America's first political parties, even as their leaders publicly denied such divisions were healthy. Politics became personal. Newspapers became weapons. Truth bent under loyalty. In 1800, the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson nearly broke the system. Bitter attacks filled the press. Accusations of tyranny and atheism flew freely. When Jefferson won, the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another became one of the Republic's most fragile miracles. Jefferson entered office preaching simplicity and restraint, but history had other plans. In 1803, he authorized the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's size overnight. It was an act of stunning opportunity and blatant constitutional overreach. Jefferson himself doubted he had the authority, but he also understood something crucial. If America did not expand, it would be consumed by stronger empires. Expansion became destiny, and expansion demanded land. Native American nations had lived on that land for generations. They negotiated, resisted, adapted, and fought. They signed treaties they believed would be honored. They were wrong. As settlers poured westward, pressure mounted. States demanded access. Politicians promised prosperity. The presence of native nations became an inconvenience to be removed. Under President Andrew Jackson, removal became policy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was framed as humane relocation. In reality, it was forced exile. Entire nations, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were driven from their homes at gunpoint. The Trail of Tears followed. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure. Families collapsed along muddy roads. Elders were left behind. Children buried their parents in shallow graves. This was not a failure of ideals. It was a decision. At the same time, the nation's economy transformed. Factories rose in northern cities. Immigrants arrived by the millions. Irish fleeing famine, Germans escaping unrest, later Italians and Eastern Europeans chasing survival. They labored in dangerous conditions, forming the backbone of industrial America. The South moved in the opposite direction. Cotton became king. The invention of the cotton gin made slavery more profitable than ever. Enslaved labor spread west with terrifying speed. New states entered the Union, locked in a political struggle, slave state or free state. Compromises delayed conflict. They never resolved it. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each attempted to balance a moral contradiction with political arithmetic. Each failed. Violence followed settlers into Kansas. Courts returned escaped slaves to bondage. Laws punished those who dared to help. America told itself it could live with slavery. It was lying. By the late 19th century, America no longer resembled the fragile republic born in revolution. Railroads stitched the continent together with steel. Cities rose vertically, their skylines cutting into smoke-filled skies. The frontier closed, not because land disappeared, but because everything worth taking had been claimed. The nation was rich and profoundly unequal. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan amassed fortunes so vast they defied comprehension. They were hailed as builders of modern America, architects of industry, efficiency, and progress. They were also beneficiaries of exploitation. Factories ran day and night. Children worked beside machines that mangled limbs without apology. Immigrants crowded into tenements, breathing coal dust and despair. Wages barely sustained survival. Labor organized. Strikes erupted. Companies responded with private armies, police violence, and federal troops. At Homestead, at Pullman, at Haymarket, workers died demanding dignity. Newspapers branded them radicals, anarchists, threats to order. Progress came soaked in blood. At the same time, America looked outward. The idea that the nation had a destiny beyond its borders gained momentum. In 1898, war with Spain transformed the United States into an imperial power almost overnight. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines fell under American control. Freedom, it seemed, traveled selectively. In the Philippines, a brutal war followed. Villages burned, civilians died. The language of liberation masked the reality of occupation. America had become what it once rebelled against. The 20th century arrived with confidence. Then came catastrophe. In 1914, Europe descended into war. America watched, traded, and profited until neutrality collapsed under submarine attacks and economic entanglement. When the United States entered World War I, it framed the conflict as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. At home, democracy narrowed. Dissent was criminalized. Immigrants were targeted. African American soldiers fought abroad only to return to segregation and racial violence. The war ended, but its promises faded quickly. The 1920s roared. Jazz filled the air. Stock markets soared. Consumption replaced caution. Beneath the surface, debt accumulated, inequality widened, and speculation replaced production. In 1929, the illusion shattered. The Great Depression consumed everything. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Families lost farms, homes, futures. Capitalism itself seemed to teeter on the edge. Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered office amid despair. His New Deal expanded the federal government in ways previously unthinkable. Social security, labor protections, public works, these measures saved millions from starvation and restored faith in governance. They also reshaped America permanently. Not everyone benefited equally. Black Americans were often excluded from New Deal programs. Women were pushed back into domestic roles once recovery began. Progress was real, but incomplete. Then came another war. World War II mobilized the nation on an unprecedented scale. Factories transformed overnight. Women entered the workforce en masse. The economy exploded. America became the arsenal of democracy. But fear followed power. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were imprisoned in internment camps. Property was lost. Lives were disrupted. Apologies came decades later. The war ended with victory
and horror. The atomic bomb ended World War II and began the nuclear age. America emerged as a superpower, its influence unmatched. Peace was temporary. The Cold War followed. Communism became the new enemy, both abroad and within. Loyalty oaths, blacklists, and fear-driven investigations destroyed careers and lives. Paranoia replaced nuance. At the same time, a long-suppressed struggle erupted again, the Civil Rights Movement. Black Americans demanded what had been promised a century earlier. They marched, boycotted, endured violence. Images of brutality shocked the world. Leaders emerged: Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, countless others whose names history never recorded. Change came slowly. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Progress again arrived through sacrifice. Yet even as legal barriers fell, economic and social inequality endured. The Vietnam War fractured trust. Lies eroded faith in government. Protest became generational. Soldiers returned scarred, often forgotten. By the 1970s, America was tired. Confidence wavered. But the story did not end. Technology surged. The Cold War collapsed. Globalization reshaped economies. America stood triumphant, uncertain, powerful, divided. Freedom expanded in some ways and contracted in others. The contradictions never left. They simply evolved.
By the end of the 20th century, America stood at the peak of its power, yet uneasy in its own skin. The Cold War had ended without a final battle. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, and for the first time since World War II, the United States had no rival capable of matching its influence. Some called it the end of history. They were wrong. The 1990s were years of confidence and consumption. The Internet began as a quiet experiment and exploded into a revolution. Information moved faster than truth. Markets globalized. Wealth multiplied, but concentrated. Factories closed in small towns, while profits flowed upward. A new economy was born, and many were left behind without explanation. America told itself this was progress. On September 11, 2001, that illusion shattered. The morning was clear, skies were blue. Ordinary life unfolded as it always had, until it didn't. Hijacked planes cut through steel and certainty. Towers fell. Smoke swallowed Manhattan. Thousands died in minutes. For a moment, the nation was united by grief. Then fear took control. The war on terror began with overwhelming public support. Afghanistan fell quickly. Then came Iraq, sold on claims that collapsed under scrutiny. The war dragged on for years, costing lives, trillions of dollars, and public trust. Security expanded. Privacy contracted. Surveillance became normal. Detention without trial became policy. Torture was debated as necessity. America told itself it was protecting freedom. History had heard that argument before. At home, inequality deepened. The 2008 financial crisis exposed a system rigged toward collapse. Banks were rescued, families were not. Homes vanished, savings evaporated. Anger simmered beneath the surface. Movements rose. Some demanded accountability. Others demanded a restoration of a past that never truly existed. Technology reshaped identity. Social media connected and divided. Algorithms amplified outrage. Truth fractured into tribes. Every belief found reinforcement. Democracy itself strained under the weight of disinformation. Race re-entered the national conversation. not because it had left, but because it could no longer be ignored. Videos of violence spread, protests filled streets, old wounds reopened. Then came a pandemic. COVID-19 exposed every fault line at once: healthcare inequality, political polarization, economic fragility. Millions died, normal life stopped, trust eroded further. America endured. It always had. But endurance was no longer enough. Elections became battlegrounds. Faith in institutions weakened. The idea of a shared reality felt fragile. The Republic, once an experiment, now faced its most modern test: whether a divided people could still govern themselves. America was never perfect. It had never been pure. It was built through courage and cruelty, vision and violence, hope and hypocrisy. Its greatest strength was not its power, but its ability to confront its own failures when it chose to. The story of America is not finished. It is not a monument. It is a question. One generation answers it imperfectly, then hands it forward. As long as people argue over what America should be, the experiment continues. And as long as that argument remains peaceful, the nation survives.